Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the first pre-event of the Malta Mediterranean Literature Festival's 12th edition. On behalf of the team, I would like to thank and welcome Ramona Depares, of course, who will be moderating this discussion, and our speakers, authors Asja Bakic from Bosnia and Herzegovina, Arvis Viguls from Latvia, and Immanuel Mifsud from Malta. It is an honor to have you all here with us. And now I'd like to give the microphone to Ramona so that we can start. Thank you.
Thank you. So, welcome to the first pre-event from the festival, and tonight the topic basically is that great divide between literary fiction and pop fiction. Oh, sorry. And is the sound all right, or is it echoing? So. The topic is the divide between literary fiction and genre pop and mainstream fiction. And we have our two speakers here who are very well placed to weigh in on the topic. Their works, poetry and prose, have attracted an amazing amount of awards, and it's been translated into a number of languages. So obviously, you know, they will be able to shed some light. I'd like to kick off the discussions with a reference to one of my favorite literary anecdotes. The author Kazuo Ishiguro is very definitely placed within literary fiction. However, he always has these speculative elements, and his latest novel, The Buried Giant, contained pretty much a lot of fantasy tropes. There were orcs and dragons. The setting is very reminiscent of high fantasy. It's a fictional and historical Great Britain. There's a quest, so it doesn't get more fantasy than this. So obviously, as expected, within every interview, Ishiguro was asked whether he would classify his novel as fantasy. The reply was a definite no, and this did not go down too well with literary circles. Neil Gaiman was very nice about it, but he's a lovely person, so you know he lets everything go by. Ursula Le Guin, on the other hand, she was quite annoyed and basically accused him of dissing on the fantasy genre. His reply is what is most intriguing. He said that nowadays genres are so fluid that there's no point really in asking an author to pigeonhole his work. Now I don't know whether he genuinely believed this or whether his publicity agent was trying to do some damage control, but it does lead us to today's topic, which is there really a point to this distinction between literary and mainstream genre, and who decides it? What is the whole purpose behind it? So I turn to my speakers. I shut up, and Immanuel, you're to my left. Left is always right. So I will put the question to you. What is your feeling about this distinction? What is the literary fiction versus pop fiction?
Well, I tend to agree with Ishiguro, definitely. And I do not think it was something advised to him by his agent. I think there are many writers and artists nowadays who basically believe that we should not pigeonhole literature. And I think in this sense, literature is following other artistic genres which had already superseded this divide. I'm thinking of Mahler, for example. Mahler, at the turn of the last century, he was composing his symphonies, and amongst other things, he was known to have this bobbing, so to speak, between high tragic music, and then at the same time, you have these popular marches going on in the background. He did it in late 1800s, early 1900s. As for visual arts, I think we all know how much experimentation had gone in that genre, especially, again, at the turn of the 20th century. And maybe literature was a bit reluctant to go there. But by time, we are finding that there are a number of works which really can't be placed anywhere. Not to mention that then there is the other phenomenon, but this we might be discussing later on, that the same writers wrote both high art literature, but they also wrote less high art literature. So,
what about you, Asja? Do you feel that there is this natural progression from, dividing genre and it's happening on its own?
Well, there is nothing natural about literature, and so I don't quite think it's the same to say I used high fantasy elements in my novels, but it's still high literature, bel art, or if you say, yeah, I did use it on purpose, and it doesn't make me any less writer for doing so. So I think if you say you use whatever you want, that means, yeah, I have this a bit snobbish perspective on what writing is. I can use whatever I want because I am I appreciated artist or writer. But I started this webpage with my friends called Moth. It's for we write about popular culture, and as a feminist, I know what it is. What difference does it make? That it makes when you say I use science fiction in my literature, or I read young adult novels, I read high fantasy, I read romance novels, because it's important to talk about it just like the rest, just like we talk about, bestsellers or the books that we find are important and we are going to learn about them in school someday. And, I don't know, the divide still exists, so we have to acknowledge that if some person writes a young adult novels, it's not on the same level as someone who writes like adult and just fiction, So I don't know. I'm not in the mood to quarrel too much, but let's see where the night takes us.
Yeah. I don't know what it is, why if a novel has some dragons and orcs, everybody thinks it's not, it can't be high literature, but I myself sometimes feel that I look differently on novels like that. And I don't know why, because they might be even good, well written and so on. And but I don't know. I have no problem reading, for example, science fiction. And for example, there's a lot of writers I consider them really great ones. And I think this snobbish attitude, I guess it's getting. It's changing a bit, because I guess more and more writers want to I don't know, to use even that stuff that I don't know, some years ago would be considered low or pop literature. So.
I see a bit of not a contradiction, but Immanuel mentioned that a writer can be both, can write both high literature and popular genre fiction. And while you are saying that you see the difference in attitude, and so does this mean do you disagree? Can there be a crossover? Would you say that a writer can be both, even within the same work, maybe?
I don't know, because I wrote a short story collection. In my short stories, there's a lot of science fiction. And it kind of surprised me when I started writing those short stories that people said, this is high literature. She uses science fiction, but it's not science fiction, like science fiction is something bad. I don't think science fiction is something bad. For example, I enjoy more playing a video game, like recently I played a game called Inside, and it's a masterpiece of short storytelling. And I don't see I don't understand why do you have to distance yourself from influences of literature you don't consider serious. And when we say he is just a science fiction writer, we want to say he writes genre, but he can't transcend that, and he stays, on a more base level as a writer. And somebody else who just uses science fiction but is not science fiction writer, he's somehow elevated by this. So I find it more sincere to say, yeah, I am also a science fiction writer. And I don't mind. I don't think that makes me a bad writer or less serious writer, but it's important to say it because people who read science fiction need to know that it is okay. It also helps develop critical thinking, and we need to talk. Literary criticism has to talk seriously about romance novels and books like that, not just when it's in serious literature, but also when it's just that, science fiction, just romance novels, and so on.
I'd like to return to the point you made, in fact, about the crossovers, because you seem to have a very definite, sort of approach to it. So what do you feel about an author being both, or whether it's impossible, whether even maybe how you consider your own works, where they fit in, if they fit in anywhere?
The question is, when we come to define whether something, some piece of work is high art or not, there are many considerations one has to take. For example, there are definitions which are attributable to class, to gender, nationality. So all these things also have to be taken into consideration. So for example, for a very long time, memoirs were not considered to be literature. And that excluded a huge number of women writers from the literary canon, because what they wrote was considered to be very memoirish. I don't know if this word exists. They wrote diaries, and those were not considered to be literary works. So basically they were excluded from the canon. When, especially in the 1970s, then there was this very important literary movement of feminist literary critics, there were new considerations which were being taken. The same goes as to class, social class, and as to nationalities and other social groups. So that's one thing which I think we also need to discuss when we come to define what is high art and what is not considered to be high art. But I think, I'm not sure if this is the question you asked me, that the writers can, in fact, produce works which are considered to be high art, and others which tend to be considered less high. Now, the problem is that what we call popular art, many times we tend to look down on it, especially the academia and the archetype of people. But when you have a writer, let's say, for example, just to give a very simple example, let's take our national poet, for example. So our national poet wrote poems like Ilin Minnu, which is one of the longest poems we have. It's considered to be a very philosophical piece of work. And many of us, especially those in the academia, hold this work to be a masterpiece of Duncan. But Duncan wrote other things. He wrote a number of popular hymns, I don't know, popular hymn to Saint whoever, and popular hymn to the other saint. And these popular hymns are extremely popular with the Maltese public. Be them church hymns or other popular, things, etc. So this was the same person composing very high art and composing very popular art.
Thank you. But is there actually a point? So this distinction maybe.
Of course, there's always there's some point, but I guess it's mostly because we want to divide and we want to have some say this is this and this is something else just to make our living here in the world easier. Yeah.
How does it help? How does it help? I don't know, readership level up, or in practical terms.
Maybe you need a little wine.
It's just very easy, but then we can say it is just pop literature and not care about it. Let's say, why should we consider, for example, Stephen King a great writer? He's very extremely popular, but of course I guess most people would tend to think that they wouldn't say that he's something like, I don't know, James Joyce or something like that, that he's still writing in the horror genre. So sometimes this genre is a bit like stigma for a writer. And for example, if you're a science fiction writer, it might be even hard for you to, you have to be actually have to work more harder to prove that you are a real writer, not just some guy who's writing popular stuff. So.
I think that this divide between high and low in culture or literature is, it just isn't welcomed in 21st century. I think so, because you have YouTube, you have booktubers. We had this conversation in Ljubljana about contemporary art criticism, and people who write academic critics, they don't even know people exist online who write fan fiction or talk about books they like. They just don't understand that it's a new movement online. If you want to search for some academic articles, you can't find any because they don't see it as relevant. And it's very relevant because these kids who read books online and then talk about it on Goodreads and YouTube are buying and selling those books for Amazon and Google, like huge corporations. Nobody talks about this. And we should talk about it because that's a serious literature. You know, they publish, I don't know how many books, they are selling millions and millions, and we are like talking about national literature, and I don't know, it's just something's wrong, and we need to talk about it. Why is it wrong? It is because this divide is just, I don't understand why it exists anymore, because the culture is changing, you know, the reading habits are changing. I'm using Kindle more than I'm reading regular books. And, you know, we still talk about these things. I find them pretty natural these days to be on social networks and talk about the things I read. And if somebody else doesn't want to participate in this dialogue, I think he's like deluded.
Arvis, in fact, mentioned the P word, popularity. How, what effect does it have on this classification? Is popularity? Does the fact that popularity is there automatically mean you're too mainstream, or you shouldn't be considered as high literature?
The question is how does a book become a bestseller? How does a writer become a popular writer? I don't know. I mean, what makes a book become a masterpiece? Honestly, I'm not sure. In the past, the academia had a lot of say in this, and people who wrote in newspapers and in journals. I tend to disagree a bit with you. I think literary critics are discussing the Amazon and the online and the Goodreads phenomenon. and there's a lot of new stuff being published specifically on this kind of reading. So I think even the academia now is becoming, maybe a bit late, but the academia is becoming interested in these phenomena. These are very difficult questions. I don't know really, because we tend sometimes to look. There is one thing which really preoccupies me. We are living in a situation nowadays in which basically we are giving the impression to everyone that everyone can be a writer, and everyone can be a musician, and everyone can be a painter, and everyone can be a photographer, etc., etc. Because there are the means, which did not exist until a few years ago. And that is also something which really worries me. I mean, for the sake of being correct and for the sake of not creating these divisions and not to be elitist, maybe, we tend to go to the other extreme and accept everything because this is a popular expression, because everybody has the right, because everybody is a born artist, etc., etc. And maybe this is my conservative forma mentis, I tend to disagree with all this, So, on the one hand, I really dislike creating these divisions. But on the other hand, I'm very much undecided because I do not want to believe that everybody is a born writer and everybody is a born painter.
In fact, Arvis and Asja mentioned the idea of selling.
We have to answer first.
Oh, okay, fine.
Reply. Maybe Arvis wants first. Okay.
I mean, about popularity, I guess it's why we look down on some things that are popular, especially in literature. I guess it's because of this great myth from modernism about great modernist writers who all didn't sell their books. And so, in order to be a real writer, we still have this myth. You have to be, poor, not selling your books, and so on. That's what I wanted to add.
Also, I would like to know, where did you find those books? You mentioned them, because when I tried to write, I actually wrote something about it, and I went to JSTOR and Project News and all these academic pages with, and couldn't find not even one text. That was 2 years ago, though. So if you please send me those links, because I'm really interested. And the second thing is, I am also an amateur. You invited me here. I don't live from my writing. I don't mind if somebody online writes a fan fiction and thinks he's a writer, because there is not just one way of writing and thinking about literature. Of course, we do not write the same way, but everybody has a right to be a writer. And I have my peers, I have friends who read and then say something back to me. We talk about literature seriously, of course, because I find that's my job, although I don't get paid for it. So I don't see why should we be scared of these amateurs? We're all amateurs. Nobody lives. Few authors live from their writings, and book publishers helps them live and earn some decent money. But none of us does. So I don't. So I don't know what's the difference between me and somebody writing online also not earning any money. It doesn't. I don't see the point in distancing myself and saying I'm better than you, because I have my readers, kids have their readers, everybody has somebody who reads them and publishes them or doesn't, I don't know.
If we're going to accept this distinction between, high literature and not, you refer to Google and Amazon and people discussing online. Is Is it even important? If someone is writing just with the purpose of creating this high literature and they're accepting that there is this distinction between them and more commercial authors, maybe should they even concern themselves with whether their works are being discussed? Or is it just for the sake of it? In other words, is there a point to seeking, approval or critics or popularity? How?
I think, I don't know. Those are quite serious questions, and I don't think we can answer them tonight. But the serious writers, the academic critics, they publish books I cannot buy. Those are the books that cost like 50 euros online, and it's ridiculous. Those are books that nobody can read because nobody has money to do it. So what you do, you read the books that you can buy or find online on some Russian sites, and you download them. You have to cut this out. So, that's the reality of every writer. So you have these popular, well-known academic writers who publish and read their colleagues for 50 euros, a text. And you have these, the other people, I want to share my books for free, because I'm interested in people reading them, actually, because I know I won't earn any money. So, it's, I don't know. Why they insist on it? I think because they can, earn well by doing so. Nobody else profits from it than the people who are, secluded and amongst themselves and share a lot of money, grants and stuff like that.
So to follow up on this, how important? You're bad at hiding, very bad at hiding. How important is as a writer for you? Is your type of readership important at all? Do you aspire to a certain type, or should you be trying to reach more people? What's your approach?
I have my, maybe 100 readers. I know them, most of them, I guess. And also, I'm from three of us. I'm the only one who doesn't write prose. I write only poetry. And I guess it depends on the situation in different countries. In my country, we are a small language. There are just 1.5 million people who can read Latvian. So, and if we see that mostly it's true that in every society, if it's democratic society, the readership is maybe 1% of population cares about poetry. And so in my situation, my country, there's nothing like, there's not such thing to be popular or something like that. You're just Latvian writer, and those people who care about that, they know that, and that's all. There's not so, I don't hope for huge readership or that people will know me on the street or something like that. So, yeah, I guess it depends in different countries, from situation, from language, from culture, from political stance, and so on.
Immanuel, what about you? Do you feel that the writer should bear in mind his readership? How important is it when you're writing to especially bearing in mind that the number of readers continues to go down, really, attention spans are. So is it something to be taken into consideration by writers while they're actually writing?
I think writers do it even subconsciously, that they have a reader, they have their reader in mind, even if they don't know who this reader is. But subconsciously, yes, they have the reader. This is something I believe. But I'm still thinking about the previous argument, to be honest. Because really. I think it's quite this relativism that basically everybody can write books and everybody can, it worries me, because then I ask myself, all right, so if everybody can write a book and if everybody is equally relevant as a writer, then why are we four here and not four other people who happen to be passing by? Because even those, then they are potential or real writers, but somehow the organizers did not choose those, but they chose us for some reason, which I would like to know why they chose us and not, I don't know, someone who publishes their own online literature, etc., etc. I know it's a very delicate argument, this, and we can debate for the whole night, which of course we won't. No.
Reader.
Yes. Look, in my case, when I was much younger and I was beginning to write, I wrote whatever came to mind without any consideration as who's going to read my books. But eventually, I started to think a lot about who is going to read these books. And I think that many writers of my generation are very conscious of this, something which previous generations did not experience. For example, that suddenly you find yourself reading to a Latvian audience, you know, and you feel, of course, not at home with these people, and you have to give them something which is yours and at the same time is not too much yours, you know. So yes, I think we all think about our readers.
Thank you. I'd love to know if anyone has something, controversial to...
I have. I'm sorry for... I think we're here because Malta loves us, because if not, we wouldn't be here. And also, I think it's generational. I understand his stance and points he made. Also, I do not agree with them. I think the younger, I'm foremost a reader. So I write because I read something that sat well with me, and I got into dialogue with something I read somewhere. And I want I want to be on the same level as any reader anywhere. I don't think I'm better because I write. I read and I write because I have that urge. I have an urge to do it. So if I meet someone who's also a reader and writes something else, maybe not academically successful or something that yet has to be published, I don't consider myself above that person because we both read. So writing is also a form of reading, because if I take my short stories or poems, I know I got influenced by many, many authors. And I cannot pinpoint and say this is what is good and this is what is bad, because I get influenced by everything, mostly by popular culture, because I grew up with it. I watched TV, I watched movies, I read poetry, I read something we call high literature. I don't believe in it, because in the way I consumed it, it was on the same level. It had the same importance to me. If I read Virginia Woolf or I read some comic book, and it has the same value. If it's well done, then you know it. It just clicks with you.
But you're not really disagreeing that badly, because you did say if it's well done.
Each other. We can feel each other. It's fine.
Allow us to leave first, please.
Yeah, I agree. I guess it's more generational, because I think that people our age are more open-minded to this. No, I don't mean. I mean in bad way or something, because on another hand, I'm a bit like in between, because when I started to write, then I guess I would look down on everything that's popular, or someone who just publishes something only on the internet and so on. But I've become more open-minded in this sense, because the world is changing and you cannot stay in the same.
Well, you are all agreeing there's a certain amount of fluidity. So, anyone would like to spice it up some more? Questions?
I would like to.
Okay, so Theo, and then please pass it on to the gentleman over there.
It's interesting that you mentioned Stephen King. One thing that comes to mind immediately after that is The Shining, the book, and The Shining, the movie. How one is considered, just another Stephen King book. The other is a work of high cinema, and there's implications of Stephen King hating the adaptation. Kubrick maybe taking the piss out of the horror genre. Where there's all these. This is another debate we can think about later. But even mentioning Ishiguro and Neil Gaiman, something that comes to mind is how certain writers. I see it happening with Neil Gaiman. There's a certain rehabilitation that happens if a certain writer is maybe a genre writer becomes popular enough, then they kind of become accepted into the sort of mainstream more. It's not happening with someone like George R.R. Martin, for example, because I think his genre elements are very much in your face. But and before the Ishiguro debate, there was Margaret Atwood with Oryx and Crake, and the similar thing. Her representation refused to be identified as science fiction when it clearly was a work of far near future, at least, science fiction. And China Miéville gave her crap for that, and now China Miéville is, I think, going through a similar process himself. So I think there is elements of the market that we cannot ignore, because obviously it's very easy to get into this kind of Manichaean, elitist versus popular debate. But there are, real world sort of economic realities that also shift the discussion in that direction. And I think we also need to consider, based on something what Arvis was saying, that we do this also because we just need to organize our perceptions. That's what people do. That's why religion exists, because life is chaotic. And this is one other example of how we do that.
Reactions from here before?
Okay.
Would anyone like to?
I would like to just point about one part of the conversation, about radical point of view of elitism and radical point of view of popular literature. I think that we live the era where we live, the era of the internet, decentralized the authority. We don't have anymore only one authority that would say, an editor that would say, this will go and this won't, this will be published and this won't. So the frustrations that we get are from the radical points of elitism and radical points of popular literature. For example, Facebook poetry, it's free. If someone writes Facebook poetry, it's online. You don't have to pay for it. Nobody can tell you that you cannot publish that. So at this moment in Macedonia, we have a situation, literally a war between the elitists, the academics, and a guy who is a very, very enormous, very popular, but not so high in quality poet. That's the guy who, and that guy was put in situation to be president of something that is connected with our national and biggest poetry festival. And when that happened, the war began between the elitists and the popular literature, because he has 40,000 people who is reading him, who are reading him on Facebook, and he's very popular, and he has an army behind him, and the institutions are having their army. So there is literally a war on internet these days. Like, friends are hating each other because of this phenomena. So I think that the point would be that there is no one authority that would say this goes and this won't go. It's open. You can choose what you think it's good and what's not. It's our choice, and it's a bit tough when you don't have someone to tell you this is good and this is not. You know, like you have everything, and now you should find out what's good and what it's not. What it's not. It's a hard thing to do. I think that would be kind of the point that I would like to make.
Thank you. Anyone else?
I have a question about... Oh, okay. Sorry. I think the conversation about what's good and what's not, and your point about Immanuel Mifsud's position being generational, obscures the art of craft, which is what in academia we like to think about. Just like an architect thinks about how he or she will construct a building, us authors and academics like to think and write and reflect, taking history into consideration. What is it that makes a text a text? And I think it's less a question of what is high art or popular art, but a question of craft. So this is just my reflection, and I don't agree that it's generational to ask this question. I, for one, tend to like to, but it's my job to take a text, pull it apart, bring it back together, and reflect on the forces that brought it together. And just as one would think about what makes a good read text, one has to be able to have the liberty to pitch that against another form of text and talk about that, rather than create hierarchies of popularity and unpopularity. Thank you.
I don't think we understood each other. I didn't say that we don't need literary criticism. That's something completely different. Everybody has a right to write, you know? You cannot say to someone you cannot write the things you write online, but we can discuss what literary criticism is. And when we had this discussion, I said, I understand people online and booktube and younger generation that reads online and feels, reads literature sensually, but you cannot read ideology sensually, and you need you need a literary criticism, and I understand what you're saying, but that doesn't mean if you read literature one way, I would read it a different way, or somebody else would read it differently. That doesn't mean that some of us are more right than others. We can come into a dialogue about it. We can use different forms of argument and stuff like that. We will read some books and then talk about them, and people online will use GIFs and, emoticons and stuff like that. So you understand what I want to say. That's not literary criticism, the things they do, but we are not talking about literary criticism. We're talking about authors, about publishing short stories, poems, and so on, not about reading those texts critically. That's a completely different story. I wanted to reply something because Gojko said a few interesting things, and that we have this, democratization online, and everybody publishes everything. But he knows as well as I do, then on ex-Yugoslavia space, there is no more literary criticism in media. You cannot publish a book, and if I have to search who's written anything about my book, I know them personally, like 5 people. They're all academics, and that's very nice. But you don't have a debate about literature. You go ad hominem because you know them personally, and there is no argument involved, there is no literary criticism, it's just, you know.
I think we can all agree that art is subjective, and literature and everything, but how would you measure how good a piece of literature is? Is it like Facebook likes or sales, or like everyone? Because obviously the internet's like an open place.
I mean, no matter is it on the internet or is it published as a book, we are still in the same situation. I mean, in the sense to understand, is it good or not good? There's no difference in the sense how we define quality of something. The reading experience is just, you're reading it maybe on the screen, but still you're reading text, so you're still dealing with the text, and I think that still you are reading it somehow the same as you would read more or less if it was published in some magazine or in a book.
I don't know, it's very subjective. Art criticism is subjective, writing is subjective. The only thing, you can ask me if I think what I say about a work is so important that people are going to believe me and say, Asja knows what she's talking about. She knows her shit. So what she tells me, that's my sacred letter. And it shouldn't be like that, because I have my own opinions, and as a reader, I search for certain values. I'm leftist, I'm feminist, and someone else is going to like something else, more formally structured, not so avant-garde, and that doesn't mean that that person doesn't know what she's talking about. So I think the dialogue is the best option we have. So if I say this poem is okay, then somebody else is not going to like it. That doesn't mean that the person is wrong or I'm wrong. Authority in literature is a really, I don't know, it's a tricky subject, generally.
Well, different philosophies came up with different reasons why something is judged to be good and something is not so good. So it depends on what your ideology is, which philosophy you belong to judge a literary piece or whatever it is. However, I think that this is not a question of opinion, and it is not a question of dialogue, because it's a question of study. It's a question of being very erudite in the way you look at things. Voicing an opinion is one thing. Putting a critical argument is a totally different thing, in my view, of course.
Anymore. Just one short thing about this philosophical schools. I really, as a feminist, am really disliking the idea that people knew what they were talking about because they had this knowledge. Because the knowledge also is a place of discord, and we should talk about that as well. Because until 20th century, certain privileged French doctors thought that female physiognomy was so weak that we weren't able to produce anything intellectually valid. That's knowledge. And for 3 centuries they thought that way. If a woman thinks too much, that's not good for her reproductive organs, or something's going wrong within her head. So when you say knowledge, I say, okay, let's think about where this knowledge comes from, who is the people that disseminates these ideas. Everything should be taken with a grain of salt. Everything. You should question everything.
Yes, but as a feminist, this argument really doesn't hold, because you have an army of feminist critics, and you can't just say, listen, because as a feminist, this is this. I mean, there are very serious feminist critics, especially since the 1970s, and we can't just brush them away. You know, I mean,
Who did that?
you.
No, I didn't.
That's what you said.
Sorry, but I never said anything wrong.
All right.
Any last questions?
It has been said, and the whole tonight has been titled "The High Literature and Popular Literature." The word popular for me sounds like something has to do with people, and the question here is what do you mean by a high literature? I mean, is it a literature which nobody understands? It's like I would bring as an argument like Palestinian Edward Said. I have read him in English, in Arabic, in different versions, and haven't really understood what he really wants to say, which he could have really simplified and said in few words. So it's again, what is a high literature? Is it that literature which reaches the people of, after all? I mean, when saying popular, as if labeling this type of, I would call it excretion, this type of secretary product. I mean, if it doesn't reach the people, so what is the hope? You know, what is the scope? What is the aid? You know, of writing high literature. Once I was told, you know, or let's say a friend of mine, his first collection of short story was refused, you know, because it was called a high eyebrow literature, which I discovered later that it doesn't go with the market. It doesn't appeal for the market. Sort of I was told that the market needs dummy things. So how could we classify a good high literature or not? Is it that literature which really hits the target and reaches the people which we after all write for our people? Thank you.
We've touched upon the topic only very slightly, it appears, and the discussion is hopefully will, you know, continue. It's all right to disagree, because it means that the whole debate is alive. So thank you all for showing up, and please do continue arguing between you. Thank you to our speakers.